Hi, the notes today are on Earth systems. This is our first unit in AP Environmental Science. So now when we talk about Earth and we talk about environmental science, what we're dealing with is the study of how things interact with each other on the Earth as a whole. So where we want to start is how is the Earth actually situated? What are its parts? What's its history? So to start off with, the Earth is really, really, really old. It's about 4.5 billion years old. Um, as the volcanism, and when it was a molten ball of rock and other elements 4.5 billion years ago and coalescing, what ended up happening is we started getting some atmosphere and we also started getting some liquids. And this molten center also ended up creating some volcanoes, and the volcanoes helped add to the amount of atmosphere by releasing gases and the amount of liquids when some of those gases then condensed and formed the oceans. So we started with some atmosphere, we get some oceans. These were not the oceans and atmosphere that we have today. They were very, very highly toxic. And it took quite a bit of time for them to kind of stabilize and some of the really caustic materials to reform into less toxic materials that would allow for life. So we go through, we have this huge amount of time, okay, of there's nothing really going on. Things are just kind of getting set up. The atoms and elements are rearranging themselves into molecules. And eventually, what ends up happening is we started getting some water being formed with the oxygen and hydrogen. We started seeing some proteins. We started seeing some amino acids forming. And we see this in our geological time record where they have some kind of bits and pieces when we go to the pre-life levels of the Earth when we've dug down that far. So going through, we started seeing some very, very simple organisms. These were prokaryotes, and eventually we ended up with some photosynthetic prokaryotes. And this was really important because once we got some photosynthesis happening, we started getting oxygen released back up into the atmosphere. And that was about all that was happening for a very long time. And so we ended up with a super oxygen-rich atmosphere. Once you got the atmosphere that was super, super oxygen rich, we started to see some diversification. We started to see some multicellularism. Now, once you get to be multicellular, the ability to become diverse explodes. You can do a lot more things with more than one cell. We go from multicellular, we started seeing some aquatic organisms, we started seeing some vertebrates, and once we get to the vertebrate point, some of these plants that are getting eaten by all of these animals that are occurring in these primordial oceans, some of the plants actually became terrestrial. They probably started out kind of like the way we think of seaweed along the beach today, where they weren't always underwater, but they weren't all the way dry either. Well, these plants slowly went out up onto land, and they adapted to a drier environment, and we ended up with terrestrial plants. Well, the organisms followed. We ended up with amphibians and reptiles that then moved away from the water, and we end up going into what we think of as like dinosaur era, which was actually quite a few levels of different dinosaurs. There were several eras there that had dinosaurs. And then eventually the dinosaurs became extinct and mammals took over. Okay? Alright, so when we talk about the eras, usually what you end up seeing is a couple of terms. So when we deal with a term, it was called pre-Cambrian. It was most of the Earth's history. This basically takes us from the origin of the Earth. We have gases just in the out in space coalescing up to about 570 million years ago. This is when we first started seeing life. Now after that we have the Paleozoic era. This is where we started seeing multicellular organisms. We got a whole bunch of insects. This is these prehistoric really big insects they actually ended up having a mass extinction, kind of like the dinosaurs did. That was Paleozoic. That was from around 540 to 250 million years ago. So then the next era that came up was Mesozoic. Mesozoic was about 250 million years ago till about 65 million years ago, and this is when we think of as the dinosaurs. This is where you have all of your dinosaurs fitting into that era. And then finally we have Cenozoic. Cenozoic is the era we are in currently. It is the era of mammals, and that's 65 million years ago to present. So this is not the era of Homo sapiens entirely, it's all mammals. So we had insects first, then dinosaurs, and then finally we have mammals. Alright, going through, as we go through and talk about like the origin of life, we don't really know. There is a lot of theories out there. The one that has the most evidence right now is Oparin's hypothesis. It is still a hypothesis. It's not considered a theory yet because we don't have quite enough evidence, and that was the idea that we had a lot of these kind of biological starter molecules, and with lightning going through, some of these molecules actually got broken, recombined, etc., until we ended up with a very kind of primitive, think of like a virus, basically a strand of DNA, and it was able to start self-replicating. Once we have that point, then with natural selection and evolution, we start seeing more and more diversity, and it took quite a while to get us to where we are with all of these very, very tiny changes of what was occurring. Alright, so we went over kind of what happened in the past when we talk about life. Now I want to talk about the actual Earth itself, the way it is right now, this moment, and that deals with plate tectonics. So we should have heard about plate tectonics at some point in elementary school. I want to say it's usually around 2nd or 3rd grade, and they talk about volcanoes and they talk about plate tectonics a little bit. But I do want to go into a little bit more detail to kind of refresh your memory and make sure everybody's on the same page with us. So, if you take a look at the map down here, these are our major plates. There are a lot of other little tiny plates that kind of fit in between on some of these plate boundaries, but for the most part, this is what our plates look like. And it's basically that underneath what we think of as our soil and our ocean, etc., we have this big sheet of rock, and these big sheets of rock that go over the molten layer of the Earth's core, they kind of slide around and they bump into each other and they move away from each other. And it actually gives us our geography. It gives us our mountains, our valleys. It gives us a lot of the topography of why the Earth looks the way it does. Now, there are a couple of different types of boundaries in between, where things can either be kind of crashing together, they can move away from each other, or they can slide past each other. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of that here in a few minutes, but each of those cause slightly different things to happen. So a couple of terms here. So the crust is the stuff that we think of as like the dirt under our feet. It's thin, it's very, very light. Even though when we think of rocks as being heavy, it's not this dense rock that we would see down underneath the mantle of the Earth's crust. Because if you go all the way down to the core of the Earth, we're not talking completely molten. It's molten towards the outside edges, but it's literally mostly iron. It's a lot of really heavy metals. It doesn't move very well. And so when we think of like granite's a lot lighter than a sheet of iron the same size. When you hear the term mantle, mantle is the actual malleable level. Think of it as kind of like a icing or pudding type of texture. That's rock that is hot enough that it is literally malleable, but it doesn't have so much pressure that it becomes a solid again, like at the core. And that's our mantle. And then finally on the inside we have our core. Alright, so when we talk about our Earth's crust, so we have a couple of things. The first two here is a divergent plate boundary, and the other one is a transformed plate boundary. Those are the two I'm going to talk about here first. So when we talk about divergent, when we talk about something diverging from each other, this is when we have two plates and they are moving away from each other. They are diverging. And when this happens, that is like this picture right here, you get magma that actually is able to come up in between those two plates, and then it starts pushing through the dirt and soil and stuff that we have there, and we start seeing new crust. This is also a point where sometimes we will see volcanoes occur. And it's where we end up with new material. We have new soil, new crust being formed. Now, the next one here is the transform plate boundary. When we have a transform plate boundary, basically this is the two plates and they are going next to each other. They're sliding past each other, and they grind along each other. We actually get a lot of earthquakes this way. We get a lot of friction, a lot of earthquakes. You end up with some of these kind of funky things, like if you have ever Googled images of the San Andreas Fault, you see things like the roads that have been split in half, or things that are bent and twisted funny. That's usually from a transform plate boundary. Our next one is the convergent plate boundary. So when we have convergent plate boundaries, what we are dealing with there is we are dealing with a convergence, the two plates coming and hitting each other. Now there's two things that can happen when our plates hit each other. They can either crash and hit each other dead on, and basically what happens there is we end up with this buckling that occur, where you have the plate material that's both going up and down, and that's where we get our mountains. We get the Himalayas. The Appalachian Mountains actually were ones like this. They used to be the size of the Himalayas, but erosion has actually taken them all the way down. If you ever go out into western Maryland and you go through one of the passes, what you'll notice is the layers of rock actually look like U's towards the top of the mountains, and that's because the only parts that's left of those big mountains are the valleys. Because the valley areas, the rock actually got compressed so tight, it's a lot denser, and so the peaks of the mountains actually got fully eroded away and now have become valleys, and the valleys are now the peaks of our Appalachians. The other thing that can happen is when these two plates ram into each other, one of them can slide on top of the other. And if you think of like car crashes, when you have two cars that crash into each other, either they both smash into each other and you get a lot of damage on both, or one of them kind of rides up on top of the other. Well, when one rides up on top of the other, we refer to it as subduction. One plate of crust slides underneath of the other. And we also get volcanoes here because basically you have this kind of new melting area, and you've got these kind of gaps that allow this to happen. So that's our plate tectonics. Alright, so to do a real quick kind of review of what I went over, we talked about the earth science points. We did the geological timescale of going through the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Precambrian being pre-life, Paleozoic is our big insects, Mesozoic is our dinosaurs, Cenozoic is us. Going through the Operian hypothesis is that lightning basically was most likely the genesis of what we see as life. Alright, our plate tectonics. Our three types are divergent, convergent, and our transform faults. It causes the continents to move over time. Most of the continents started out as one landmass. When we hear the term Pangaea, that was our big one that had the dinosaurs. Everything was crashed together. We do see earthquakes and volcanoes at those plate boundaries. Alright, I do want to kind of touch base a little bit more on earthquakes. Earthquakes occur when rock along a plate boundary shifts and it causes movement, and it releases energy. That energy is in the form of a shock wave. When we talk about volcanoes, this is usually along a plate boundary when one is either convergent with each other and goes underneath, or it is divergent. And basically it's when the plate material melts and the magma spurts up to the top and we have an eruption. I did want to do a very quick note on seasons. Seasons is due to the tilt of the earth, not how far away it is. The closer you are tilted towards the sun, the warmer it feels. When it's tilted away, we get the winter. Also, when we have solar intensity, the closer you are to the equator, the more intense the sun is, so you end up with warmer temperatures because the sunlight's actually hitting you directly straight down versus hitting at an angle. When light hits you at an angle, you don't actually feel as much of the heat from it, which is why